When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not come visit me." Then they will also answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger or naked, or sick or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life."
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah.
Something about a retired professional teacher reading to you that's like, oh, just keep going. So you're probably thinking, boy, it's thin because it's August 14th. And then you went like, no, it's because of that passage. People read ahead and went like, I'm out. I'm entirely out on that. And I don't think I would blame you. If you're a guest, welcome. Here's the good news, whether you're a guest or not. I don't think that this passage means what I think our first inclination, or even what we've been influenced to think it means. I don't think that's what it is at all. I think there's some work we can do there. But first, I want to frame it around this idea of famous last words. You ever use that phrase, like famous last words? So I found myself thinking about this passage in that way, which I'll talk about in just a moment this week, and then I spent some time on Google going like, I wonder what the famous last words are. So I thought we'd play a little game. So maybe you'll recognize them. So go ahead. First one, Steve Jobs. What do you suppose he might have said? Apparently, he was actually on a deathbed when, in fact, there were some famous last words of his. Ready? It's a little ominous, but go ahead. Apparently it was, "Oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow." So that's kind of confirming. Something was going on there. Next one, Jack Daniel of the famous beverage, whose family is probably doing pretty well today. What do you suppose his were? I think this one's funny. Go ahead, Marla. Appropriate, perhaps. One last drink, please. Getting a little bit darker on this one, Princess Diana. This one kind of freaks me out because, this was I don't know how long ago, and even then we still have recordings of her. It's this reminder of, someone pointed that out to me recently. If Siri can respond to your query just out of nowhere, that means she's listening all the time. But that's a different topic for a different day. Go ahead, Marla. Apparently hers were, "My God, what has happened?" A little dark. And then the last one, Conrad Hilton, most famous for his daughter. Or is it a granddaughter? What is Paris? Is she? I should have looked that up this week. He is the founder of the hotel chain, who apparently on his deathbed was asked, "Okay, so Dad, do you have any final words of wisdom?" I love what he said because he's obviously type A. Here we go. "Leave the shower curtain on the inside of the tub." I'm with him. I don't understand why that's rocket science, but apparently it is rocket science material. So to frame Jesus these words in that kind of motif of famous last words, it wouldn't be accurate if I was suggesting it was literal. These aren't literally Jesus' last words. This story about sheep and goats and heaven and hell and up there and down there, that whole story, that wasn't the last thing Jesus said. Not according to Matthew's gospel, not according to Mark's gospel, not according to Luke's gospel, not according to John's gospel. But I do think it plays a similar function, and here's why. First of all, Matthew, and we haven't touched this throughout this message, throughout this series, which has gone on forever, which will end next week, by the way. Matthew frames Jesus' teaching around 5 discourses. There's these 5 extended sermons or lectures, teachings that Jesus does. These are the last ideas, or this is the last story from the last of those 5 discourses. Now, the reason for that 5 may or may not be lost on you. It has to do with the Pentateuch or the Torah and all these different things. But this is the last time that we get to meet Jesus the teacher, Jesus the rabbi, Jesus who's plying his trade, if you will, who's teaching his disciples. What happens next is what we often refer to as Passion Week. Remember, we jumped ahead during Lent to Matthew 26 and went through almost the end of the gospel, except for saved the Great Commission. So what happens next is Jesus' triumphal entry, and that his famous last meal, his eventual prayers in Gethsemane, and then his arrest, the trials, then his being beaten, then his being crucified, his dying, being buried, resurrecting, and then coming back. That's what follows. So another way to say that is this is the last time that you get to hear from the Jesus who's kind of in charge of his environment, kind of getting to pick what he does next. And so there is this function of finality, of like, what are you trying to say? So what I want to try to do this morning is suggest that when we view it through that lens, I think it helps, and I think it takes away some of the heaviness of it. And yet I also get, and this happens to me often, there's this tension between God is bigger and more important than me, and what brings me to God are my own personal trials and needs and wants and desires. It's a tricky tension. And I'm getting that there's probably not a single person in the room who came to church this morning because you're like, you know what I need is a really academic lecture on what Jesus was talking about sheep and goats. We don't care. We don't care if it doesn't matter to us. So I think there is this question of who cares? Like, I'm a newly divorced person. I'm a newly married person. I'm now a parent. I'm now an empty nester. I'm a part of a business that I'm not sure is going to survive a recession. I'm trying to find a house, and I can't afford one now. Suddenly there's cancer in my body. I have this back pain. I have this relational breakdown. I have this addiction. Or in my case, I can relate to just the anger piece. I'm working through Advent right now and trying to get ready for that, and John the Baptist this week, and it's kind of challenged me to think about, like, repentance is a part of the Christian life, and just felt kind of prodded like, hey, Adam, you could work on anger. I feel like I'm getting a little flabby in that department. And so for me, there's this question of how does this help with anger? Like in where the rubber meets the road, how does this matter? And again, I think it does, but it's going to require a little bit of work. One final thought before we jump into it. I probably should have started by asking the extent to which you are or aren't familiar with this story. If you've spent much time around church, you're probably familiar with it. I was talking to a friend this week who their familiarity with it took them back to their childhood and a certain church experience, and to say it was a negative trigger is not an overstatement. You can use this story about sheep and goats and taking care of people to do lots of things emotionally to people. Here's the way I had internalized it. I highly doubt that I ever actually even heard a sermon from this direction, because mostly I would have left a church that was teaching this story. But then I committed to the Gospel of Matthew as a whole, and I had to personally. Here was my impression of it, and maybe this resembles your own. That at some point, all of us, and most likely for myself at my death, somehow I'll be sorted between the good place and the bad place, and that'll have something to do with the extent to which I visited people in jail and took care of people who were sick and fed people who didn't have food and clothed people who didn't have clothes, and thus generally it'll have something to do with the extent to which I take care of the least of these. How that interplays with this understanding of the gospel and grace and the cross, I don't know that I ever took the time to work through, but somewhere built in the algorithm was going to account for whether or not I had ever donated to the local rescue mission, to be a little facetious. Relate to that? My argument this morning, my suggestion, and I hope maybe even what frees you a little, is there's a couple things. Does God care about the least of these? Of course he does. Is it a part of the narrative scope of the text that he wants to raise up a people who care for them? Of course it is. Is that what this story is about? It's not. And I wouldn't stand up here and say that if that was just my own opinion. N.T. Wright, a guy named Craig Keener, who is the editor of, I think, the best study Bible out there, the Cultural Background Study Bible, he, in his exhaustive take of Matthew, also says that's not at all what's going on here. I think there's something important, and actually something maybe even more relevant to the heat in your own life. So let's just I just want to look specifically at a few things. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he'll sit on the throne of his glory. That's from the School of Redundancy School. Despite all the money I've spent learning how to study the Bible and time, I think the thing that helps the most is just this realization of studying is about making observations and asking questions. And I think the question here is, so what does Jesus believe about the world? What is Jesus, how does he see the timeline? If you gave him a Sharpie and a giant whiteboard, is it a circle? Just this perpetual cycle? Or does he see creation and time as headed somewhere? He obviously sees it as headed somewhere. And as difficult as it is for us, because this expanse of time is so long, clearly what he's pointing to is there will be some point when this type of life ends and this next section, this next season, or what the Jews would have called this next age, begins. So there is this system of accountability. There is this system of hey, it matters what you do. I've been thinking about it myself. I think for the first 12 years of our existence, and for sure in the first 20 years of my career, the focus has been Jesus makes you better at life and makes your life better. And I firmly believe that. I also think that there's another chord, another note, another wing to the airplane that's equally important, and it's your life is temporary and you're accountable. So that's part of what's going on here, yes. But the other thing is who? Who gets to make those decisions? Who gets to play that sorting hat kind of role, if you will? Who puts themselves in that spot? It's Jesus. Now, you maybe have heard it said, the problem with Christianity is that Jesus was a great guy and a brilliant teacher. He just never claimed to be God. I think this is one of those instances where we push back on that. He didn't walk around wearing a bracelet that said, what would I do? It's not the way he communicated. No, what did he do? He just said, hey, at the point when the whole world is judged and the good are sorted from the bad, that'll be me. If not a claim to divinity, I don't know what it is. So yes, that tension, should have went boating today. There's something to that. Verse 32, one more thought. There's this guy, Bishop Robert Barron. Let me note this too. You may have heard of him. I understand that some of you are Catholic cautious, and I can respect that. I do think that he's the C.S. Lewis of his day and is doing just incredible, incredible work. I noted his podcast stream on the Mind Map this week. I heard him in a recent podcast. He noted that one of the great arguments against God is that it's emotionally convenient. And this is the type of work he does that I think is so brilliant. And he allows, that's true. It's emotionally convenient to believe that at the end of your life, it's not just over. And then he said, but atheism is also emotionally convenient. It's just as emotionally convenient, he says, to believe that what you do with your life doesn't matter, that you're accountable to no one, that it's all very temporary. And his point, he actually says, so I think if we're being fair, those two arguments cancel each other out and we should move on to other arguments. Clearly, Jesus is upholding this idea that accountability is a thing. Verse 32, all the nations will be gathered together before him, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Notice all the nations, all the goyim, all the Gentiles. Is Jesus claiming that what he's saying is just relevant to Jewish people? No, he's making a really huge claim. In that same podcast, he references Nietzsche. You may have heard of him in his famous statement, God is dead. What I didn't know was that there's this pretty honest historical debate around what was the emotional tone with which this famous philosopher was speaking. It's often celebrated as though he was saying it triumphantly. Like, God is dead and we're all the better for it because we're out from underneath the yoke of the man. It's a kind of Epicureanism that would say at the very worst, God's a long ways off, but for sure he doesn't care about what we're doing, so go live your life. It's a liberation kind of statement, some would say. But others would say, no, that's not the context of it at all. Others would say the context would be one of grief, of anguish, the sense that even though it would seem that he had very strong atheist ideas, clearly, he even is aware of, now what? Like, what do we do to govern ourselves in a world where we can't agree on what's right or wrong? I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think someone was telling me that the next line is something like, and we killed him. What I'm trying to bring to the surface here is this kind of culturally foreign, but within the narrative of the text, very familiar concept that things are funneling towards a point, and at that point, things really matter. Verse 34, then the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. A couple things that I think are worth pointing out there. First of all, foundation of the world. What's going on there? This is, to me, I think part of what's shifted in my own faith experience is this understanding that we're a part of this massive, cohesive story. The foundation of the world. What is the claim being made there? Isn't it something like God created things in the beginning? He had ideas in mind. He created people in his image, that they would be his image bearers, that they would put the divine on display. And then, as Jesus says in the Gospel of John, when he says to the disciples, no longer do I call you slaves, but no, now I call you friends. This is a story about walking with God and for God. And in other words, though we're in this slight momentary interruption between what God intended and what will be, the cohesive story still stands. God is still bringing it back to the garden that would become a city where people would reign with God. So he's claiming that he's bringing us back to that point. And I get this is so uncomfortable to our modern sensibilities. It feels judgmental. It feels like something that, like, it's just not kind. It feels a little bit, dare I say, like hickish almost, like just this, like you can't see things this way anymore. And what's helpful to me is this realization that the extent to which we reject this view of the world, we're not just rejecting Jesus. We're rejecting some of the best thinkers, some of the best ethical and philosophical thought in human history. This idea, many would argue, didn't start with Jesus. It started with Plato, who lived 400 years before Jesus. He was the one that popularized, in the West in particular, this notion of this funneling point where things will be separated between the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, so to speak. Uncomfortable, yes. Worth considering, you get to decide. But this is the big question, isn't it? Isn't the big question, so who are they? Who are the people in jail? Who are the hungry? Who are the sick? And therefore, who are the ones being judged? Well, he already told us, that's all the nations. So okay, so who are they? And this is where I think, for me, I was both frustrated and relieved when I spent time with the longer narrative of this. Verse 40, and the king will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Now, chances are probably high that the extent to which you've read the Bible, you've read the NIV, which is the most popular version in our types of communities, and it reads, these brothers and sisters of mine, which can come across a little more vague, but even within the Gospel of Matthew, that's a phrase, it's reserved specifically for who? The church. There's this one time where some people are drug in front of him and they're like, hey, your mom and everybody's mad at you. And he's like, who are my brothers and sisters? Those who do what I say. So do you see what just happened here? Who is this applied to? Who, or rather, who are the people in jail? Who are the people hungry? Who are the people who don't have clothes? Who are the sick? Who are the least of these who needed something? Is it humanity in general? Well, according to this story, who is it? It's the church. It's early followers of Jesus. What's the context of this story? I watched this week a bunch of famous pre-game lectures or speeches. There's the great one from the movie The Miracle. There's We Are Marshall. I didn't think of Hoosiers at the time, but I'm sure there's one there. And then there's our contemporary voices like Ray Lewis and Drew Brees. I watched one really funny one of an 8-year-old Little League coach who was, I'm assuming it was a joke, but it didn't seem like one at the time, where he told one kid that his dad was a loser and that he wasn't here to have fun but to win the game. That kind of stuff. I think that's what's going on here. Why? What's the context? Who's Matthew writing to? Matthew's writing to the early church somewhere around AD 70-something. The temple's gone. And as an early Christian, what is your life? Well, your extended family hates you, much like we know of current Muslim context. But by leaving the Jewish faith to follow Jesus, which wasn't what they intended, but it was the way it was received, your own Jewish kin despised you and wanted you gone. Obviously, the Romans did. The Greeks did. Your life was brutal. Being thrown in jail was real. Lacking food was real. Therefore, being sick was real. Not having clothes was real. So what's Jesus saying to them? See, here's where I think that the pregame speech motif works. What's he saying to them? Isn't it something like, first of all, I'm in charge. We can go ahead to that next one, Marla. Like, the big brother's in charge. There's this assurance of, this is my world. And though it won't always look like it, I'm the king. Which leads to the second, I think, emotional point of, and I'm taking note of what you suffer. I'm taking note of what you're going through. Go ahead to that next slide. There's this sense of like, so head on out there and run into that wall and just know that justice is going to be served. Which leads to this point of like, okay, so who cares? And what does this have to do with my marriage or my divorce or my cancer or my economic crisis or my internal crisis? What does it have to do with my life? Well, here's an idea, and I hope it's not offensive, but what if it's something like, it puts your problems in perspective? That one of the great advantages of being a Christ follower is we have a single mission, a single job to do. And it's something like, to be a Christian is to be sent into the world. This is where I love the taking Matthew in as its cohesive narrative, because how does this story with what became the early church start? Come follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. And then he says things like, if your righteousness doesn't surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious elites of your day, it's not good. I'm going to make you a different kind of good. And then he says to them in the most brilliant sermon ever, you are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Remember, these are a people who he fundamentally called. Here's a challenge. Identify someone in the narrative who was called, Old or New Testament, who wasn't also sent. It doesn't happen. It's a contradiction of ideas. Here's how this works for me as I've just processed my own anger. It's actually not about me. It's even not about a moral violation. This is the great work of N.T. Wright, I think, around these ideas, that to see sin purely as a moral violation is kind of to miss the point. Is it a moral violation? Are we not supposed to be angry at other people? Sure. But deeper than that, what's the problem? He would say it's a vocational violation. That when you lose your anger, you fail to put the divine on display. You fail to be who you're called to be. And there's something about these final words of Jesus, if you will, that seem to somehow be conveying this idea, I've got a job for you to do. And sometimes you're going to be put through hell doing it. And stay the course. In that same sermon, Jesus, but strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. It's either one of the most abusive statements ever spoken, or if it's true, it's profound. Because if it's manipulative, then he's saying, give everything up to this one end, me. which sounds a lot like a cult in some contexts. But if it's accurate, if it's true, if Jesus invites us into a way of being human that says, God, you use me, you send me, you keep my focus on you and your objectives, and I'm going to trust that you're going to take care of everything else. It's incredibly liberating. Some of you are so new to the Jesus scene that you don't have enough track record to see that Jesus does deliver on that promise. And others of us, we recognize the cycle of the judges, which is that we do have a track record and we forget it, and then we're humbled and reminded of the track record again. There's something in there, isn't there, of a Jesus looking at other people and not hiding from the fact that their following of him, in their case, might get them thrown in jail. And he's going, therefore, he's not saying, therefore, avoid it. He's saying, therefore, trust. I've got your back. Finish that. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today. I think if I was being fully disclosing and honest, I think even the value of things like Sunday morning is changing for me. I think I've spent most of my career trivializing its importance. I think my attitude was, it's not important, but we're going to be so good at it that you'll be here anyway. But I think ideas like these are reminding me that the life of faith and faithfulness, the seek first his kingdom life, is extraordinarily difficult to live out. And we need these built-in liturgies that keep us on that track. So I don't know where the heat is for you. I don't know what the pain is for you. It might not even be pain. It might just be opportunity that's so grand that it could easily get you in trouble. But I wonder if there's some value in remembering that the sheep and goat story, it's about a God who sends people into the world that oftentimes comes at great cost to themselves, but a God who says, don't worry, the world's headed somewhere. It's a cohesive story. It'll pay off in the end. It reminds me a little bit of Dallas Willard in his apologetic on suffering. He notes that the 3-year-old child in Africa who dies, if there is no God, lived a completely purposeless life, and his or her suffering served no purpose. But if there is a God, if there is a future, then he said that the good news built within the suffering is that suffering doesn't get the last word, that the suffering does serve a purpose, that it is headed somewhere. I don't know where the heat is for you, but I wonder if there's just this opportunity to recognize the bigger picture, and thus to recognize also that these slight momentary afflictions, as Paul says, are building for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure. So we're going to take communion tonight, or this morning, and I think hopefully it's this opportunity for you just to kind of reflect on like the dichotomy of me and my little problems, me and my big problems, and a God who's so committed to the mission that he died and invites me to be a part of the same story with him. So the band's going to come up here, lead us in a song. I'll jump up and lead us through. I'd like to pray as we just move in that direction. God, Lord, there's such a fine line between over-spiritualizing things and seeing things through your lenses. There's such a fine line between trivializing real, personal, acute pains and seeing them through your lens. And so my prayer this morning is that in these remaining moments that you'd give us something emotionally and behaviorally that we can walk away with that allow us to just course correct just a little bit. We love you. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.